You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guests today are Ambassador G. Philip Hughes and Ambassador Thomas T. Riley. Ambassador Hughes was U.S. Ambassador to Barbados, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines from 1990 to 1993. Before that, he was Executive Secretary of the National Security Council in the White House. Ambassador Riley was Ambassador to Morocco from 2003 to 2009, and he was selected to be the recipient of the State Department's 2009 Sue M. Cobb Award for Exemplary Diplomatic Service. He returned to the private sector, running networking and data center operations and developing large-scale solar projects around the world. And we and our spouses and a number of other fellow former ambassadors and their spouses and friends came back in May from a very interesting mission to the West Balkans. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Every several years, the Council of American Ambassadors sponsors a mission to an interesting part of the world. And this year was to the Western Balkans. And we have a mix of ambassadors who have different experiences, served in different countries, and bring fresh eyes to countries that they often have not been to before. In this case, I was the only one on the trip who had been to Albania and to North Macedonia before. Ambassador Hughes and Ambassador Riley had not been to any of the three countries, and I had not been to Kosovo. I was particularly interested in going on the trip because I had previously, before I was ambassador, served on the board of the Albanian American Enterprise Fund, which the U.S. government set up to try to help develop free market economy in Albania. And when I was ambassador to Romania, most of my time was related to the war in Kosovo, and I'd never been there. So for me, it was interesting to see these places through that experience. But it was even more interesting, I think, for Ambassador Hughes and Ambassador Riley to see these countries for the first time. Let me start by asking you both a question. One thing these countries have in common is they want to come into the European Union. And there's a lot of discussion in each country about that. And obviously the European Union is important all the time, but it's particularly getting attention these days because of the Putin's war in Ukraine. The European Union worked very closely with NATO. What were your impressions? Let me start with Ambassador Riley. What were your impressions of the countries and their interest in joining the EU and maybe some of their challenges?
Well, first of all, I think the thing that I kept forgetting was how small the countries were, particularly Kosovo and North Macedonia. Each have a population of about 1.8 million. So they're saying we're now our own independent country and we want to act just like all the other European countries and have defense and finance and take care of our people. And it seemed very, very ambitious. Was one reaction. And I don't know whether the EU has actually, you have to be this tall to get on this ride kind of a requirement. But the other thing was that we obviously learned with great interest was part of the biggest resistance from other countries was from other Balkan countries who were putting in whatever negative influence they could to slow up other applications, which is, I suppose, expected, but sort of surprising at the same time.
I'll just respond to one comment you made and then go to Ambassador Hughes. The UN does not have a how tall are you requirement. Luxembourg is a member of the EU, so they take small guys. Ambassador Hughes.
Well, yes, I like Ambassador Riley. I was impressed that these were very small countries, but they're pretty much in the same size scale as the republics of the Baltics, incidentally, a region that the Council also visited in 2018. And in that sense, it struck me as quite natural that these small, newly independent countries in a part of the world formerly dominated by communism, even if it was Yugoslav communism, not quite Soviet communism, would want to cement their economic future to the biggest, nearest, most prosperous grouping of countries that is available, the European Union, and that would be related to securing their security via NATO ultimately, in which, by the way, Albania and North Macedonia already participate as members, and cementing themselves to what they called the Euro-Atlantic community. If I were a small, fragile, newly independent country like that, I have very much those ambitions.
Well, what do you think were the differences between their challenges among the three countries in getting into the European Union?
Well, if I might, I'd say Albania's challenge, the biggest challenge is internal. That is, corruption and the stability of its democracy are its seemingly biggest hurdles. It doesn't have any obvious external or neighborly detractor. But in the case of Kosovo and North Macedonia, respectively, neighboring Serbia for Kosovo and neighboring Bulgaria for North Macedonia seem to be the biggest obstacles.
Tom, do you have any comments on that from your perspective?
And the obstacles, as was explained to us very clearly by many political parties and leaders, were odd things like related to language, for example, and even North Macedonia got the brunt of that, even struggling with having to change their name, and then whether or not they actually had their own language or that's somebody else's language, and recognizing minorities. So they seem to be, at least the way it was expressed to us, relatively petty things that were holding up the whole application process, which has to be hugely frustrating, where they had to change their constitution. And even as we were there were still new things coming up saying, next you have to do this before we allow you to proceed with your application.
But Jim, one of the things that strikes me now that we've come back from the trip and that we're seeing other things unfold in international relations is that there's become, maybe it's not new, but it's certainly revived, a feature of diplomacy among ostensibly friendly countries. And that is seeing the opportunity to extract concessions on things on which they might have otherwise little leverage from the fact that a particular country wants to achieve an important goal, like entering the EU. We've seen this just now with Turkey and Sweden and NATO in unblocking Turkey's objections to Sweden's entry into NATO. They basically just added additional demands because they had the opportunity to. And that, I think, temptation is kind of built into this sort of friendly diplomacy. I'm not sure what we can do to discourage it.
I actually, having served in a country, Romania, which was not in the European Union at that time, is now in the European Union, but learning a lot about the European Union while I was there, that structure in the European Union is a feature, not a flaw, because the European Union was designed to get these countries who had been fighting with each other, take Germany and France, for example, to give them a stake in working with each other and forcing them to all the time have to think about compromise and think about, we're going to do this together, not separately. And for countries that are not in an organization like that, it seems kind of odd, but that is really a big part of the European Union vision. And therefore, as you talk about in the case of North Macedonia, they had to change their name to get into NATO because the Greeks believe they're Macedonians. And that's a big part of the Greek identity. And the North Macedonians think they're Macedonian. And they're both right. But identity is a big part of life. And similarly, on the language side, in that case, it's the Bulgarians do not believe that the Macedonian language is separate from the Bulgarian language. And language is a big deal, as we all know. I mean, it's very much kind of an identity. And so I agree, it must be, it clearly is incredibly frustrating as they're trying to do this. But again, I think that plays into these are the kind of conflicts that in the past have led to wars in the Balkans. And the idea is with the European Union, you work it out through negotiation as opposed to killing each other, which has gone on a lot in the Balkans over the years. So I chalk that up to great progress. Are there any other issues related to the European Union that you want to talk? You talked on corruption in Albania. Either one of you want to talk a little bit what we learned about that?
Well, one of the things that I think we all noticed right away is that we had through, I would say, I thank the Council of American Ambassadors for packing in a pretty tight schedule, but it gave us an opportunity to meet with not just the current leaders, but the political parties who were out of leadership. And I think, I didn't keep an exact record, but it looks like every party that we spoke to talked about the other parties as being corrupt. And I'm not sure if you put that together, that suggests perhaps that maybe they're all right at the same time. So that clearly was something in the way of progress and getting things done. And this may not be the right time to comment on it, but I think we saw some examples of what that can do to a country, not just sounds like a bad thing, but it actually prevents you from moving forward and achieving the goals.
Philip, anything else on that topic?
Well, in a way, something related. The corruption problem, it occurred to me, was particularly acute in the case of Albania. At least references to it and accusations about it. But there is another thing that was kind of peculiarly related to it, and that is the parlous condition at the moment in an authentic competitiveness context of Albania's opposition party, the largest of which had been the Democratic Party, but there are other smaller opposition parties as well, because these parties made a decision in response, supposedly, to corruption of the government to boycott a national election, and I believe also to boycott a set of local elections that effectively put them way out of power and way behind the ruling governing party in terms of trying to claw back a participation in government. So in this case, at least allegations about and accusations of corruption have had a political repercussion that maybe because of bad judgment or whatever has made Albania's democracy look to the outside not thoroughly competitive any longer.
I think it's a very useful point. Yeah. One thing that I was struck by, not having been to North Macedonia in a long time and never having been to Kosovo, in terms of differences, and it is related to the European Union, is that interethnic relations are a big issue, as we talked about a little earlier, in the European Union. The European Union cares a lot about how you get along with your ethnic minorities. And you have a situation with Albania, which does not really have a significant ethnic minority. It's a much more homogeneous country. Whereas Kosovo has a material Serb minority right next to Serbia, which is an issue of great controversy all the time. And then you have a significant Albanian minority in Macedonia. And what was interesting to me was that in North Macedonia, the Albanian party operates like the Hungarian party does in Romania. There's a big Hungarian minority in Romania. They ally with whoever wins the election. They're the people who put together a governing majority. And so we met with the Speaker of the Assembly in North Macedonia, who's from the Albanian party, even though the majority of the folks there are Macedonian. I think that's something that really is helpful to North Macedonia in terms of getting into the European Union, that their internal ethnic relations seem to be a lot better than the internal ethnic relations in Kosovo.
Very
Philip?
good point. If I might offer a further sort of amplification of that, the parties in the all three countries, but maybe especially in Kosovo, at least one party, it is from time to time advantageous for different parties in these contexts to gain advantage by striking a very nationalistic posture for the majority population, the majority ethnic population. But that's kind of counterproductive, ironically, for their internationalist interests in a European context. Because if you get elected as a super nationalist who's not going to knuckle under to the unreasonable demands of a small minority that's being egged on by your kind of adversary neighbor across the border, well, then you're kind of stuck for how you manage your relations with that minority once you are in office. And if you manage them too pugilistically, too toughly, then you damage your chances with the EU. That's a kind of dilemma that they've got built into their domestic politics, it seems to me, where domestic interests and international interests sometimes collide.
Yeah. Tom, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say this is sort of hot breaking news. It just happened last night. I don't know whether you both had a chance to see it, but Prime Minister Kurdi was making a presentation in Parliament, and this is on most of the major news networks with, unfortunately, an accompanying video clip of not just what you would see in Britain with some screaming and booing, but actual fighting, men and women grabbing, punching, slapping, bodyguards getting involved. It was a nice little appropriate reflection of what we're talking about, which is not just theoretical, these feelings and who you talk to and who said what to whom. They're obviously right on the edge of things falling apart. So that was, I don't know whether we can attach that to this Zoom call, but it sort of exemplifies some of the things we're just talking about, which sound like happen all over the place. This is really on the edge and pretty serious. Not just, am I able to pass a law, but am I able to actually have a meeting together with other people and not come to physical blows?
Well, I'm sure, like Jim, I did catch this on the news last night, and it was just another reminder, not to advertise our Council of American Ambassadors, but another reminder of how timely our visit to the Southern Balkans was. It's the second or third time in just a few weeks that we've been back since this part of the world erupted into the news. The last time being just shortly after we left the countries, when in northern Kosovo, as a result of an election that again was boycotted, in this case by the Serbian minority, the result was the election of Albanian ethnic mayors in several towns that are majority Serb cities, and an eruption of Serb protests and blockades that prevented them taking office, and ultimately the calling in of NATO peacekeepers, nearly 100 of whom I understand were injured in the ensuing fracas, and some 50 local Serb citizens as well, or Kosovo citizens who happen to be Serbian, all over, again, this issue of ethnic friction. So it was certainly a timely visit because this region is erupting more and more in the news.
And I know you're not suggesting that all of this has happened as a result of our.
No, I don't think we caused it.
I never threw water at the prime minister. That was when I was actually leading the group that day, and I refrained from doing that. So.
It's interesting you talk about that kind of disruption in the parliament, and you all are probably better historians than I am, but a lot of that went on in the Congress in the 19th century in the United States. People were shot, people were beaten. I don't know whether it happened in the 20. It had not happened in the 21st century that I've noticed, but I don't know whether it happened in the 20th century. But it was quite often in the 19th century, and probably was in the lead up to the Civil War and other things where that happened, which is actually a good analogy. I mean, the Civil War, we talk about people can't get along in the Balkans. Well, we had a civil war where 900,000 people were killed. So keeping people together is hard anywhere on Earth. Let me move over to not the local folks there, but to other interested nations, Russia and China. Their names came up periodically during our visits. What's your sense of what China and Russia are, how they fit into the Balkans?
Well, that was something that was of particular interest to me because I continue to do business in other parts of the world. And in most places, you see some kind of Chinese involvement. So I was sort of interested to see that and compare it. I think in our meeting with Ambassador Kim in the beginning, she was sort of describing the Russian influence as being very aggressive and very active in elections and disinformation, and the Chinese as being more soft, and mentioned something I thought was interesting, that apparently they used, the Chinese funded the local stations and paid for the soft pieces about how wonderful China is, and things about silk making and cute panda bears. But in particular, China, which I know we discussed it at the time, when we were driving from Albania, Kosovo, we drove along this very impressive, beautiful road that we all commented on and were wowed by. I mean, state of the art, going along the river and through the mountains, beautifully constructed road done by Bechtel, an American company that I'm pretty familiar with. That's very good. That's very expensive, but prides itself in usually doing projects on time and on budget. And when we arrived in North Macedonia, I remember some of the Council of Albanian ambassadors who were helping organize that part of the trip talked to me just when we first walked into our hotel saying, big scandal. The government has done something absolutely terrible. They have signed this $1 billion contract with Bechtel to build a highway, and they are allowing overtime and hire whoever you want. And if you come across a national treasure, you can continue building. It's just an outrage. That was the first thing we saw. Well, you dig into it a little bit and find out that almost 10 years earlier, the Chinese bank provided a $1 billion loan to build about a 100-kilometer road in North Macedonia. And it was the worst possible combination of things. There was so much corruption, the road basically really never got started. There were people accused of skimming off huge amounts of contracts. And I think they came to the conclusion, this is not good, and we better do this the right way or we're in trouble. And in fact, Ambassador Kim mentioned that assets, physical assets were taken, although the Chinese are going to have very little recourse to try to take ownership of a freeway that never got built. But my feeling is that the Chinese system kind of allowed the corruption that was all there ready to go to happen. They didn't have to stuff envelopes or force people to do something against their will. They simply provided the money and let the North Macedonians go forward. So the involvement, in particular China, I think, has sort of, we've talked about corruption, exposed the corruption and shown that with the wrong player who allows it to happen, it's going to be devastating for the Chinese and for the North Macedonians. And they're learning a very painful lesson on that specific example.
My appreciation, Jim, is that the Russian role here is rather more a traditional role that Russia has played historically in this part of the Balkans. They've long been a friend of and regarded themselves as a protector of Serbia, a nation who uses the Cyrillic alphabet and whose language is Slavic, etymologically related to Russian. And in this case, not only is that a kind of a historic and seemingly fraternal sort of thing to do, but especially now with war raging in Ukraine from the Russian invasion there, it's a pressure point with NATO because Kosovo is effectively a NATO creation. NATO intervened to stop the Serbian genocide of Albanians in Kosovo, and ultimately NATO's support has made it possible to erect an independent Kosovo, something the Serbs are reluctant to acknowledge as even a reality, even the truth. So each time the Serbs use that Serbian minority or stand up for that Serbian minority in Kosovo and cause trouble for Kosovo, it means also causing trouble for NATO or reminding NATO of its vulnerabilities and exposure in the Balkans, maybe even to caution NATO, if you can caution a membership organization of that size, 31 to 32 members, to be careful about admitting new members. In that sense, Russia's geopolitical role here is very different to China's, which is far more distant, far more commercial, far China's role, that is, and far more, I think, related to picking up additional friends and allies along the way, maybe even luring them into debt traps that enable the Chinese to exercise more influence, but where the immediate geopolitical import is less significant than it would be if we were talking about a piece of territory of geography in Asia.
One of the interesting differences between these three Balkan countries, West Balkan countries, and most of Central and Eastern European countries, is they were never part of the former Soviet Union, and they were never part of the Warsaw Pact. Both North Macedonia and Kosovo, as part of Serbia, were part of Yugoslavia, where Tito had split with the Kremlin soon after World War II. It was a much more open system than the Warsaw Pact countries or the Soviet Union. Albania was even more removed from the Soviet Union because when the Chinese communists split with the Russians, Albania politically went with China, not with Russia. And so, but that also created historical ties between Albania and China that way precede the end of the Cold War. So I say that only to make the point that this is complex beyond our ability to hold it all in our heads. These relationships that are.
Yes, that is true. And one of the things, Ambassador Riley may want to comment on this as well, that was a key feature, I think, of our takeaways from this trip, was finding how pro-American these countries are in their basic attitudes. I mean, Albania made a great ceremony of tracing this to Woodrow Wilson's defense of an independent Albania in the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I. And further, President George W. Bush's standing up for an independent Kosovo on a visit to Albania that he paid during his presidency. But also in Kosovo, also in North Macedonia, a great deal of pro-American sentiment. And in Albania, that exists side by side with the legacy of that historic relationship with communist China during Albania's very isolated and otherwise minded communist period. So the Albanians don't have bad feelings about China in the way that we often do, but they do have good feelings about us, and those two things exist in parallel.
I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah. I'm not sure how many places in the world have Bill Clinton and George W. Bush statues. You'd have to look long and far, I think, to find too many other places. Pretty much exemplifies it.
Exactly. A Bill Clinton shrine in Kosovo makes perfect sense because it was, the struggle that the Clinton administration importantly drove in the 90s to stop the genocide and to liberate Kosovo, and a Bush statue outside of Tirana, as I recall, in Albania, commemorating his visit and his declaration about Kosovo.
Well, those two things also really underline, they're really good points, underline the soft power of the United States. Now, in one way, you say it's the hard power because there was a war in Kosovo. Woodrow Wilson, those were negotiations after World War I. But it is sort of extraordinary the way foreign political figures, a George Bush or a Bill Clinton, are like neighborhood friends when you're in the Balkans, because they're a big part of their history and their sense of who they are and where they fit into the world. Let me go to one more topic before we wrap this up, and that is obviously what's going on in Ukraine right now is on the front burner. It probably will be for a while for the United States and certainly for all the Europeans as well. Well, and China's got its own deal there. I mean, India's playing a role. It's a worldwide issue in many ways. Do you have any takeaways from the visit to the three West Balkan countries, of things that are relevant to thinking about what's going on in Ukraine now and what will have to go on in Ukraine in the future?
I had just one thought on a superficial level is, we've now got a new word about the Balkanization of something, and what happens when you take a country and divide it up, and we saw what those results were. None of us, of course, have any idea how the Ukraine situation will resolve itself. Certainly one possibility is some kind of a negotiation, and maybe chopping off a few parts, maybe Crimea or something. We do something that is very similar. And it's just a reminder of caution that might seem expedient. There's going to be problems afterwards when you arbitrarily, as Ambassador Hughes was talking about, sort of remotely from Europe or someplace else, sort of say, okay, we're now going to draw this line, and this is going to be the two new countries, and Russia's going to withdraw and say it's never going to be as simple as that. That's certainly one thought.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I had several thoughts about this. I think first of all, it's significant that these very small countries, as Ambassador Riley properly underscored at the beginning, and economically fragile countries, inherently because of their size and where they're located, have nevertheless really bent over backwards to be as supportive of the Ukraine as they possibly can, including Kosovo, which isn't in NATO yet. And I think there's a point about that. It's not only wanting to demonstrate their Euro-Atlantic vocation and volition, but also to make a symbol of solidarity with a country that is being a victim of naked aggression in violation of the UN Charter and numerous other international commitments of Russia. Secondly, I think any small nation, or practically any nation, in the face of this kind of naked aggression is going to see all the more clearly how important it is to have defensive allies. And the gold standard so far of defensive alliances in the world today is NATO. So it's going to confirm, of course, Albania and North Macedonia's good luck in getting themselves into NATO, even if North Macedonia had to change its name to appease Greece in order to do so. And it's going to make Kosovo all the more eager to culminate a NATO accession someday. But third, it also, I think, changes the politics, if you would, and the argumentation about NATO expansion. When you think back to the previous rounds of NATO expansion in the very late 90s and the early 2000s, this was a controversy, especially in the West, about whether this was necessary, whether this was prudent, whether it was preparing for the last war that was receding into history, the Cold War, and even senselessly antagonizing Russia with the appearance of a sort of anti-Russian coalition emerging on their border. So I think the logic of all that now, post-invasion of the Ukraine, is profoundly transformed, shall we say, and the skeptics about further NATO expansion are going to have to base themselves on something other than agonizing over whether we're antagonizing Russia. It's obvious, even to longtime NATO members like Germany, that this has transformed the security environment and therefore transformed or further strengthened the argument for robust defensive alliance against the main threat to stability and peace in Europe.
It's interesting that there was that debate. I recall very vividly, and that's in fact why Romania didn't get in the first wave, because it was is Romania a bridge too far? And obviously it did get in, and more countries have come in. The single biggest driver for expanding NATO was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Boom, Finland. Boom, Sweden. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that nothing has strengthened NATO as much as Putin invading Ukraine. Now, it's a hell of a thing for Ukraine, and so we wish that hadn't happened. But I think your point is well taken.
Now, I think the argument about expansion is going to be turned more and more on sheer feasibility of the defensibility of some very small outpost very far from the centers of Western strength and very near to Russia's border. So it's not like the invasion of the Ukraine makes the admission of Georgia immediately an automatic yes for NATO, but it's not going to be on grounds of, is this going to upset Moscow? It's going to be on grounds of,
that's a good point.
Is somebody going to call this insurance policy on terms we can't pay?
I thought you were thinking of Barbados, but probably not. But one other aspect in relation to Ukraine that I knew about for Albania, but I saw for myself in Kosovo and in North Macedonia, is people tend to assume that countries that were under communism for a long time and countries that are poor in Europe, I'll leave it to Europe, have great difficulty recovering and growing their economies. That has not been true in Central Eastern Europe. And even without being in the European Union, and even with not all of them being in NATO, these three countries basically have done well economically. Albania is one which I'm most familiar with. It was the poorest country in Europe. It's now, I don't know the numbers exactly, but it is for 3 decades, has a way above average growth rate in Europe. And one of the things that was interesting in Albania was all the talk about how much tourism there was now in Albania. Because Albania has beautiful coastline in the Adriatic, so does Croatia. But people tended to go to Croatia, not to Albania. And now they're coming to Albania. And as a small country, a little bit of tourism goes a long way. So I think the economic growth of these areas pre-EU accession was pretty impressive to me.
True. I was going to make a kind of a related comment. We visited 3 capitals fundamentally with a couple of stops along the way. And I was impressed, frankly, by how different the 3 capitals were. Tirana, the capital of a country that's been independent for over a century and has a very definite sense of itself ethnically, essentially, to me, looks like a capital whose growth was stunted for decades and only recently has been able to kind of break out with new and modern architecture in what otherwise was the proverbial one-horse town during communism, especially in Hoxha's brutal and Stalinist version of communism. By contrast, Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, struck me as looking very much like an American town. Almost all the signage is in English. Almost all the products advertised are US or European major brands. Everything from stoplights to just the way the place is organized has a great deal of, if you would, Euro-Atlantic or American influence. And that shouldn't be surprising given how it has emerged from former Yugoslavia and specifically from Serbia. And Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, is different still. It's a forest of monuments to different heroes from North Macedonia's heroic past, from Philip of Macedon to Alexander the Great, to statesmen of North Macedonia's history, and also of neoclassical or European style buildings, also an affirmation of their connectedness to, again, the European cultural milieu, different to the places further east. So I think each in its own way, the capitals are almost like a psychological expression of something underlying in the population, in the country, in its aspirations and its sense of identity.
A little bit like the difference between Boston and West Texas.
Yes, in a way, yes.
On that note of national cohesion, I want to thank Ambassador Hughes and Ambassador Riley for joining this podcast today. It was a joy to take the visit to the West Balkans with you and your lovely spouses, and look forward to going someplace again with you.
Great. Great.
This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.